The silence didn't come first. The shock did. A shock that rolled through Westminster like a cold gust under an old cathedral door. Because late last night, long after the lights dimmed over the Thames and the journalists packed up their microphones, something unexpected happened inside the walls of Parliament. A document was slid across a polished oak table. A motion was signed. And a single sentence inside it raised a question no one ever thought the British government would dare to ask. Should Meghan Markle, the woman once celebrated as a modernizing force, a symbol of diversity, a global celebrity turned duchess, be stripped of the right to use her royal title in her new business empire? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's where tonight's story begins. Not with the title itself, but with what it represents. Power, branding, influence, legacy, and a commercial identity so valuable that entire marketing firms have spent years dissecting it. But here's the question that Parliament quietly hinted at. Who actually owns that identity? Meghan? The monarchy? The British people? Or does a title stop belonging to you the moment you monetize it? Think about that for a second. Have you ever seen a celebrity reinvent themselves so many times that even the reinvention starts to feel like a product? Actress, influencer, duchess, podcaster, lifestyle mogul, brand architect, and now a new global business portfolio built around her personal story, her voice, her aesthetics, and yes, the aura of royalty. But tonight, that aura is being challenged in a way that could rewrite the rules for every royal, every spouse, and every commercial venture tied to the crown. So why now? Why this moment? Why Parliament? That's the first twist. Because according to sources inside Westminster, this didn't begin with a politician. It didn't begin with a law. It didn't even begin in Britain. It began in America, with a set of trademark filings connected to Meghan's newest venture. Filings that referenced language suspiciously close to protected royal terminology. Filings that suggested branding built on heritage that no longer legally belongs to her. Filings that, for the first time, crossed from inspired by royalty to leveraging royal identity. And someone noticed. Not a critic, not a tabloid, not a Twitter account, a trade compliance advisor. Picture that. A clipboard-carrying bureaucratic figure whose job is usually to flag mislabeled food packaging and counterfeit toy imports. And yet, somehow, this person triggered a political chain reaction that is now threatening to shake Meghan's entire commercial infrastructure. How? Why? What did they see? That's where curiosity starts to heat up. Because if a single filing can ignite parliamentary scrutiny, what else is buried beneath the surface? What other branding documents exist? What partnerships were signed? What slogans were drafted? What global licensing deals were being prepared under the assumption that nothing, and no one, would ever question the use of the word duchess? But someone has. And here's where the emotional tension rises. Because Meghan's supporters say she earned her place, her identity, her narrative. Her critics say she abandoned the institution the moment it no longer suited her. Her defenders say she was pushed out. Her detractors say she cashed out. Her fans say she is independent. Her opponents say she is opportunistic. And Parliament is saying something completely different. Parliament is saying this is about legality. Which raises another question for you. Should a royal title be used to sell products? Should it be printed on packaging? Should it appear in brand messaging? Should it be part of a commercial empire headquartered in a foreign country, outside crown jurisdiction, beyond protocol oversight? Or is that exactly why this moment is happening? Because the timing is suspicious, isn't it? Meghan launches a new business identity. Headlines explode. Investors whisper. Social media rages. And just as momentum builds, someone in the British government decides to step forward and say, not so fast. Is it protection? Is it punishment? Is it political theater? Or is it something even bigger? Because here's another twist. This move didn't just materialize out of thin air. There have been murmurs for months. Discussions behind closed doors. Cross-party chatter. Government historians reviewing centuries-old precedents involving titles, commercial exploitation, and reputational risk to the crown. And if those precedents hold, this may not simply be a warning. It might be the beginning of a full legal reclassification of Meghan's public identity in Britain. And if that happens, her empire changes overnight. Imagine the ripple effects. Logos recalled. Merchandise redesigned. Licensing halted. Marketing rewritten. International partners backing away. And the story shifting from glamorous entrepreneurial rebirth to something far more humiliating. No more Duchess. Not by choice. Not by branding. Not by reinvention. But by law. Now ask yourself, how would Meghan respond to that? Would she fight? Would she rebrand again? Would she claim victimhood? Would she call it misogyny, racism, jealousy, or retaliation? Or would she pivot strategically and publicly declare she never needed the title anyway? And more importantly, would the public believe her? Because that's where this story goes from political to psychological. The monarchy has always survived by controlling symbolism, and Meghan has always succeeded by controlling narrative. Two powers, two strategies, two worlds colliding over a single word that can no longer comfortably belong to both sides. The monarchy can't afford to look weak. Meghan can't afford to look diminished. Parliament can't afford to look irrelevant. The press can't afford to look bored. The public can't afford to look indifferent. Everyone has something at stake, which is why tonight's revelation matters, and why it matters now, and why the tension surrounding it feels like the opening scene of a much bigger confrontation, one that no PR agent, no palace advisor, no journalist, no influencer, and no strategist can fully predict. Because here's the most unsettling part. According to a source quoted in a late-night parliamentary corridor, this motion is only the first step, meaning what you're hearing tonight is not the climax. It's the beginning, the spark, the ignition point, the quiet inhale before the explosion. And if Parliament is preparing to go further, if the next phase is already drafted, circulated, or whispered into the right ears, then Meghan's new business empire may be standing on a fault line she didn't even know she built upon. So here's the final question that sets up the rest of this story. If this is just the first move, what comes next? Because the next move isn't a theory. It's already in motion. And once it surfaces, it won't just target Meghan's branding. It will target the very foundation of her public identity. But before we get there, you need to understand the part of the story that most media outlets are too nervous to touch. The trigger that pushed Parliament from idle observation into active escalation. Because according to insiders, it wasn't the branding itself that alarmed lawmakers. It was the pattern. A pattern that suggested Meghan's new empire wasn't just using her identity. It was positioning itself as an alternative to the institution she left behind. Think about that for a moment. A duchess who steps away from royal duties? Fine. A duchess who builds a career outside the monarchy? Acceptable. A duchess who forms a brand that subtly replaces royal symbolism with commercial equivalents? Now that's a different story, and it raises an uncomfortable possibility. Was this empire designed to eclipse the monarchy in cultural influence? Some MPs reportedly believe so. And once that suspicion entered the room, it didn't leave quietly. It grew. It circulated. It took on momentum. It became a quiet fear disguised as a procedural concern. Because Parliament may argue legality, but beneath legality lurks something deeper, authority. Who has it? Who defines it? Who gets to wield it? And more importantly, who loses it when someone else gains too much? Here's where the tension sharpens. For decades, the monarchy has relied on mystique, distance, tradition. The idea that royalty is above commercialism, above branding, above the marketplace. But Meghan represents the opposite. Accessibility, monetization, storytelling, celebrity logic applied to royal architecture. And for many politicians, that represents a threat not just to the monarchy, but to national identity. So when Meghan's business filings appeared to blur the boundary between commercial persona and royal legacy, Parliament interpreted it as something more than branding. They interpreted it as encroachment. And that's when the discussions shifted tone. Not angry, not dramatic. Worse, strategic. Because governments don't panic. They prepare. They study. They gather examples. They wait until action looks like responsibility rather than retaliation. And that's exactly what happened. By the time the motion appeared, the groundwork had already been laid. Historical precedent? Checked. Legal feasibility? Confirmed. Public reaction analysis? Completed. Media timing assessment? Calculated. Meaning this wasn't spontaneous. It was coordinated. Which leads to another question that keeps the curiosity flame burning. Who orchestrated it? Was it a senior politician protecting tradition? A legal scholar worried about trademark dilution? A royal ally passing information quietly under the table? Or was it someone with a personal grievance, hidden behind parliamentary decorum? There are whispers, but no confirmations. Yet. But here's what we do know. The motion's language wasn't vague. It referenced use of royal associated identity, commercial exploitation concerns, protection of constitutional symbolism, and most telling of all, it implied that continued use of a title for commercial gain may require formal review. Formal review. Two words that in government language translate roughly to prepare for consequences. Now imagine being Meghan in this moment. Imagine waking up, seeing the headline, and realizing that the very word that has powered interviews, book deals, production partnerships, media fascination, and brand authority might soon be off limits. Not because she surrendered it, not because she renounced it, but because it was taken. There is no greater narrative loss for someone whose entire public arc has been framed around empowerment, autonomy, and self-authorship. Which brings us to the emotional core of the introduction. Because this story isn't just political, it's psychological, philosophical, symbolic. It taps into something humans instinctively react to, the loss of identity. The idea that the world can decide who you are, regardless of what you claim, what you believe, or what you build. And that fear, that universal fear, is why people cannot look away. Even if they love Meghan, even if they dislike Meghan, even if they feel nothing at all about the royals. Everyone understands the terror of having something that defines you suddenly threatened. And that's why this story matters. Because it isn't about tea time scandals, or tabloid gossip, or social media drama. It's about power at the deepest level, the power to name, define, label, and strip away. Parliament has stepped into that arena, and Meghan's empire is now standing in the center of it. But here is the most electrifying part of all. Sources claim that the motion Parliament introduced last night includes a second page that has not yet been released to the public. A page that reportedly outlines the next step, the escalation phase, the moment where the government moves from questioning to enforcing. What is on that page? Who signed it? When will it surface? And what happens when it does? That's where the introduction ends, because that's where the true story begins. A story of alliances, leaks, motives, legal maneuvers, branding recalculations, royal pressure, global reaction, and a tightening circle around a woman whose public identity has never been more valuable or more vulnerable. Because the next chapter doesn't just reveal the trigger. It reveals the person behind it. And once that name comes out, everything changes. It didn't start with a headline. It didn't start with a debate. It didn't even start with a politician clearing their throat in the chamber and addressing the speaker. It started with a whisper, a quiet, easily ignored whisper circulating between staffers, advisors, and parliamentary aides, that Meghan Markle's newest business filings contain language close enough to protected royal identifiers to raise an eyebrow. And not just any eyebrow. The kind of eyebrow that leads to investigation, clarification, and eventually confrontation. Here's the shocking part. The first person to raise concern wasn't a monarchist, wasn't a royal loyalist, wasn't a conservative traditionalist terrified of modernity. It was someone who supported Meghan's exit from royal life. Someone who believed in independence, autonomy, reinvention. Someone who thought stepping away from palace obligation was healthy, even necessary. And that person is the one who flagged the document that ignited what is now becoming a political firestorm. Why would a supporter do that? What did they see? What line appeared crossed? That's where this chapter begins. With contradiction. Because according to an internal briefing note, the concern wasn't ideological. It was legal. Specifically, whether Meghan's new empire relied on the implicit authority of a title she no longer uses in an official capacity. And if so, whether that constituted a misuse of a protected royal designation in ways that could confuse the public commercially. Let that sink in. This wasn't about patriotism. It wasn't about loyalty. It wasn't about punishing Meghan for leaving. It was about regulation, and regulation is far harder to fight than emotion. Now imagine the moment that briefing landed on the wrong desk, or the right one, depending on how you see it. A senior MP, known for scrutinizing constitutional boundaries, reportedly read the note twice, set it down, and said one sentence that would ripple outward for months. This needs to be looked at, not attacked. Not condemned, not politicized, just looked at. But in the world of Parliament, being looked at is far more dangerous than being criticized. Criticism burns hot, then cools. Scrutiny stays cold, sharp, and surgical. And here's where tension rises. Because Meghan's new business empire wasn't just another celebrity venture. It wasn't a perfume line or cookbook or athleisure brand slapped together for a seasonal cash grab. It was strategic, carefully architected. Built with messaging, aesthetics, tone, color theory, thematic language, and narrative continuity. It was designed to imply heritage. And that implication is what triggered the chain reaction. Have you ever watched dominoes fall? Not from the outside, but from the perspective of the first domino. That moment where you wobble, tip, and know there is no going back. That's where Meghan's filings now sit. Because once that MP opened the door, questions followed. And questions in Parliament multiply quickly. Who approved these filings? Were advisors aware of legal limitations? Was the branding intentionally royal adjacent? Was the public meant to associate nobility with commercial products? Was Meghan leveraging a title she publicly rejected, but privately profited from? And here's where the emotional sting enters. To Meghan's critics, the answer was obvious. To Meghan's supporters, the accusation was insulting. To Parliament, the truth didn't matter yet. Only the investigation did. Because the MP didn't make an accusation. They made a request for documentation, precedents, expert input. And once that request entered committee circulation, something unexpected happened. Other MPs joined in. Not from the same party. Not from the same ideological spectrum. Not for the same reasons. Some saw constitutional risk. Some saw commercial misuse. Some saw cultural confusion. Some saw an opportunity to assert parliamentary authority in a post-monarchy era. And one, according to leaks, saw something personal. We'll get to that later. But for now, understand this. Parliament does not act collectively without purpose. If multiple MPs from different wings of the government express interest in a single issue, it means the issue taps into something foundational. So what foundation does Meghan's branding shake? Identity. Specifically, the identity of the monarchy as an institution not available for sale, licensing, franchising, appropriating, or commercial reinterpretation. And here's where things get even more intriguing. The MP who pushed this forward didn't present it as an attack on Meghan. They presented it as protection of national symbols, constitutional heritage, and the clarity of royal distinction in global perception. Smart move. Very smart. Because if they had framed it as anti-Meghan, support would fracture. But by framing it as pro-institution, pro-clarity, pro-regulation, they made opposition look irresponsible. So while Meghan was preparing product lines, partnerships, promotional language, and carefully curated rollout strategies, Parliament was preparing something else. The groundwork for restricting her ability to use the word that built her brand even after she left the palace behind. Duchess. The word that made her more than an actress. The word that elevated her above influencer culture. The word that turned her from celebrity into symbol. And now, that word was being examined under legal fluorescence. But here's a detail almost no one knows. Before Parliament moved forward, one more step occurred. A quiet one. A polite one. A procedural one. Meghan's representation was reportedly contacted informally and asked for clarification. Their response? Silence. Not because they ignored it, but because responding would acknowledge vulnerability. And vulnerability would imply liability. And liability would justify escalation. So silence became the spark. And that silence convinced the MP to take the next step, a step that would pull more eyes, more voices, more authority into the issue. Because the MP didn't simply file a concern. They requested parliamentary research. And when parliamentary researchers get involved, things move from conversation to documentation. And documentation is the bridge to action. So now the question becomes, what did those researchers find? Were Meghan's filings harmless? Were they borderline? Were they clearly in violation? Or did they reveal something bigger, a coordinated branding strategy tied directly to royal identity? And more importantly, who alerted the researchers to where they should dig? Because evidence doesn't organize itself. Someone guided them. Someone with knowledge. Someone with motive. Someone who, at this stage, remains unnamed. But not for long. Because the next part of this chapter reveals exactly who reported Meghan's filings and why their involvement changes everything. Here's where the story twists. Because the person who first reported Meghan's filings wasn't a politician, an activist, a royal correspondent, or a furious traditionalist longing for the days of powdered wigs and horse-drawn carriages. It was someone inside the branding world. A marketing strategist. Someone who had previously worked with celebrity image transitions. Someone who understood the mechanics of perception, audience psychology, and aspirational identity. Someone who, according to leaked notes, had been approached months earlier to consult on a separate project, a project they later discovered was indirectly connected to Meghan's expanding business ecosystem. And when they recognized the overlap, they panicked. Why? Because they believed, and stated privately, that Meghan's new branding direction was not simply influenced by her Duchess identity, but dependent on it. That without the Royal Association, the entire visual and linguistic framework would collapse into just another lifestyle label in an oversaturated market. In other words, they believed Meghan's empire was built on a title she could not legally defend. And rather than confront her team directly, they chose the safer route. They notified a regulatory contact. A contact who then forwarded documentation to a trade advisor. A trade advisor who then filed a procedural alert. A procedural alert that landed on the desk of the MP who set everything into motion. Like a fuse, lit by accident, but burning with intention. Now here's where the audience starts to lean in, because this raises a new set of questions. Was the strategist motivated by ethics? By professional liability? By resentment after being passed over for the contract? Or by something even pettier, the knowledge that Meghan's empire might succeed without them? Motives matter, and yet, Parliament didn't care. They didn't investigate the whistleblower. They didn't audit their credibility. They didn't measure bias. They only looked at the material, the filings, the language, the associations, the implications. And the more they looked, the more uncomfortable they became. Because Meghan's public statements claimed independence from royalty. But her commercial framework implied the opposite. And contradiction is political oxygen. By this point, researchers had assembled a portfolio of materials, packaging prototypes, phrasing patterns, trademark adjacency, thematic descriptors, even color palettes historically associated with royal iconography. None of these, individually, would have triggered concern. But together, they formed a pattern the MP described as commercial proximity to protected royal identity. And that phrase, that exact phrasing, is what made other MPs pay attention. Because if Meghan had indeed built a brand reliant on commercial proximity, then Parliament had jurisdiction. Now the tone shifted. No longer curiosity, no longer observation, no longer preliminary interest. Momentum. And once momentum enters politics, it does not slow down. So researchers compiled a second report, this time focusing on international implications. Specifically, whether the branding risked misleading global consumers into believing Meghan retained official royal endorsement. And that, right there, was the moment everything changed. Because misleading the public, even unintentionally, is something Parliament cannot ignore without appearing negligent. And so, for the first time, the question became official. Was Meghan Markle commercially benefiting from the Duchess identity in a way that could be interpreted as authorized? That question alone justified escalation. But here's where suspense tightens, because while this research was being compiled, Meghan's team still had no idea. No warning, no inquiry, no leaked heads-up, no journalists sniffing around. They were operating business as usual. Meetings, brand rollouts, logo refinements, partnership feelers, investor conversations. Completely unaware that, behind closed doors, Parliament was drafting language that would soon become the most significant legal threat to her brand since leaving the royal family. But then, something else happened, something even more unexpected. A second MP joined the effort. Not because of legality, not because of branding, but because, according to sources, they believed Meghan's growing commercial empire posed a reputational risk to the crown itself. This MP reportedly argued that the monarchy could not prevent Meghan from speaking, acting, producing, or influencing, but it could prevent her from monetizing royal association. This wasn't about consumer clarity anymore. It was about symbolic protection, identity preservation. monarchical boundaries. And once that angle surfaced, the issue evolved from regulatory concern into constitutional significance. But here's the part that truly stunned observers. This new MP was not aligned politically or ideologically with the first. They belonged to a different faction entirely. And when two opposing political forces align behind one motion, that motion becomes inevitable. Researchers expanded their scope. Committees were discreetly briefed. Parliamentary legal analysts were consulted. Royal advisors, unofficially, were informed. And Meghan? Still unaware. Still building. Still branding. Still expanding. Still assuming Parliament had moved on from her. Until a final trigger sealed the chapter. A media outlet, small, obscure, otherwise irrelevant, published a speculative piece claiming Meghan's new empire was inspired by royal elegance and duchess refinement. Normally, this wouldn't matter. But parliamentary researchers included the article in their portfolio as evidence of public perception risk, the exact risk that justifies regulatory action. And that article, insignificant on its own, became the final weight that tipped the scale. The MP who initiated the inquiry read it and reportedly said, "That's enough. We move forward." And with that sentence, the motion began drafting. The foundation was laid. The energy shifted. The path forward became unavoidable. But the most dramatic turn of all, not the filings, not the strategist, not the MP coalition, not the constitutional angle. The real shock is who enters the story next. Because the next chapter reveals the alliance behind the MP, a group no one expected, with influence no one can ignore, and an agenda that goes far beyond Meghan's branding. The moment the second MP aligned with the first, something subtle but unmistakable shifted inside Westminster. Conversations that had been quiet became intentional. Side glances became signals. Calendar slots opened for meetings that did not officially exist. And in the political world, when silence becomes coordinated, it means only one thing. An alliance is forming. But here's the twist. This alliance didn't form out of shared ideology. It formed out of shared incentive. Different motives, different philosophies, different reputations, united by a single, converging concern. That Meghan Markle's growing business empire might redefine what a royal title means outside the monarchy. To some, that was branding evolution. To others, it was cultural erosion. To Parliament, it was jurisdictional trespass. And trespass demands response. Now here's where the story gets even more gripping, because alliances in Parliament rarely stay small. Once two MPs unite, the question becomes, who else benefits? Who else wants influence? Who else sees advantage in joining the push? The answer arrived faster than anyone expected. A third MP reached out privately, someone from a completely different background. Not constitutional, not cultural, economic. They were concerned that Meghan's empire could distort international trade positioning, particularly in markets where royal symbolism still carries economic weight. Yes, economic weight. Think Commonwealth nations. Think former colonies. Think regions where royal ties still affect buying behavior, diplomacy, tourism, and media consumption. This MP reportedly asked a chilling question. What happens if a duchess becomes a global commercial brand independent of the crown? That question didn't just deepen the inquiry. It legitimized it. Because now, the issue wasn't about Meghan. It was about economic sovereignty. And that's when the alliance solidified into something more powerful, a cross-party initiative. Rare, strategic, difficult to oppose without appearing careless. Suddenly, what began as concern became momentum, and momentum became inevitability. But here's the part no one saw coming. Once the third MP joined, a fourth emerged. And this one brought drama. Because this MP had history. Personal history. Not with Meghan directly, but with the impact Meghan had on the royal family's public perception. They believed, and stated privately, that Meghan's exit damaged the monarchy's image, destabilized public trust, and emboldened anti-royalist sentiment. To them, restricting her commercial use of the Duchess identity wasn't regulatory. It was retribution. And though their motivation was emotional, their influence was real, because they were connected to committees dealing with heritage preservation and national representation, which meant they had the ability to steer language, tighten definitions, and close loopholes. Suddenly, the alliance had legal authority, economic justification, cultural protectionism, Emotional fuel. That combination is volatile. But the most shocking part wasn't the MPs themselves. It was who began advising them. Behind the scenes, a group of constitutional scholars, experts in royal precedent, started providing guidance. These were the people who study centuries of title law, ceremonial boundaries, and the fine line between personal identity and institutional property. And according to leaks, they said something Parliament was not expecting. There is historical precedent for removing or restricting a title if it becomes commercially exploited. Those words electrified the alliance, because now they weren't pushing boundaries. They were following history. But just when it seemed the story couldn't twist further, it did. Because another group entered the frame quietly, discreetly, almost invisibly. Senior palace officials. Not in writing, not in statements, not in official capacity. Through nods, through suggestions, through passive agreement. They did not request action. They did not direct Parliament. They simply did not oppose it. And in politics, lack of resistance is endorsement. But here's where the real shock comes in. Because if palace officials were aware, then someone else almost certainly was too. King Charles. Whether he approved, tolerated, ignored, or strategically allowed it, no one knows. But his silence speaks differently than others. His silence carries weight, implication, and consequence. Because if the king objected, the alliance would crumble overnight. And it didn't. Which means the alliance grew stronger. More MPs joined discussions. Researchers expanded documentation. Legal language sharpened. Media preparation strategies drafted. Timing windows examined. International implications mapped. But the alliance did something surprising. They didn't go public. They didn't leak. They didn't posture. They didn't grandstand. In fact, they did the opposite. They worked quietly. Why? Because they understood something Meghan perhaps did not. Public battles empower her. Quiet ones corner her. And so, while Meghan's team planned branding launches, Parliament planned containment. While Meghan prepared messages, Parliament prepared mechanisms. While Meghan anticipated attention, Parliament anticipated compliance. But here is where curiosity spikes, because alliances always have leaders, and the leader of this one is not the MP who started it. It's someone else. Someone whose identity has not yet been revealed publicly. Someone whose involvement explains the speed, coordination, confidence, and strategic silence of the movement. Someone whose political reach extends across parties, committees, and cultural influence. And according to a source, this person has one defining characteristic. They believe titles cannot coexist with commercialization. Not ethically, not historically, not constitutionally. This leader is the reason the alliance became unstoppable. But who are they? What is their connection to the crown? Why did they step forward now? And what do they stand to gain? Those answers come next. Because the second half of this chapter doesn't just name the alliance leader. It exposes why their involvement guarantees that Meghan's empire will face consequences. The alliance had force, momentum, and legal scaffolding, but it still lacked something critical. A face, a figurehead, a voice that could move between parties without suspicion, communicate without provocation, and influence without appearing to lead. And that's why the identity of the person who ultimately stepped forward stunned even those inside Westminster. Because the individual who emerged wasn't loud, wasn't combative, and wasn't known for public crusades. They were known for something far more dangerous. Being respected. A senior parliamentarian with decades of experience in constitutional interpretation. Someone who had served through multiple prime ministers. Someone who understood the monarchy not as celebrity symbolism, but as a structural pillar of national continuity. Someone who reportedly said, in a closed analytical session, a title is not a brand. A title is a burden, and if discarded, it must not be reclaimed for profit. That statement didn't just resonate. It crystallized the alliance. Because now the issue had philosophical framing, and philosophical framing is what transforms political initiatives into legislative inevitabilities. With their involvement, the tone changed. The discussions became disciplined. The documentation became refined. The messaging became intentional. But here's where the audience leans forward. Why did this figure care? What motivated them? What pushed someone with no personal investment in Meghan's drama into the center of the most explosive parliamentary maneuver since Brexit debates? The answer lies in something few people outside government circles understand. The monarchy is not just ceremonial. It is a stabilizing mechanism. It anchors national identity, societal continuity, and the illusion, yes, illusion, of apolitical unity. And if a duchess can transform a royal title into a commercial brand, then the monarchy becomes a marketplace commodity. And if the monarchy becomes a marketplace commodity, then Parliament loses authority over national symbolism. That was the fear, not Meghan's success, not Meghan's independence, not Meghan's personality. It was the precedent. Because if Meghan could do it, why not others? Why not future spouses? Why not extended relatives? Why not distant lineage? Why not anyone with a genealogical footnote? This wasn't about Meghan. This was about containment. And no one understood containment better than the alliance leader. That's when they made a decisive move. They summoned a confidential briefing, bringing together the MPs involved. No aides, no recorders, no transcripts. Phones surrendered at the door. Windows physically checked for line-of-sight vulnerabilities. A meeting style used only for matters involving national security, intelligence cooperation, or monarchy stability. In that meeting, according to leaks, the leader presented a single-page analysis. Not multiple pages. Not a dossier. Not a binder. One page. And on that page was a question. What prevents a former duchess from commercializing the title indefinitely? Below it, nothing, unless Parliament acts. That single statement aligned the alliance completely. No more hesitation. No more uncertainty. No more theoretical debate. But the briefing didn't end there. Because the leader added something else. Something that escalated the issue from concern to urgency. They revealed private polling. Polling that showed younger generations no longer understood the difference between royal authority and royal celebrity. Polling that suggested Meghan's branding could reshape public perception of what a duchess is and who defines one. If perception shifts, identity shifts. If identity shifts, legitimacy shifts. If legitimacy shifts, the monarchy weakens. And Parliament cannot allow that. So after the briefing, the alliance members didn't return to their offices casually. They returned with purpose. They began shaping language for what would become the first parliamentary action to challenge Meghan's business empire. The language was subtle, intentionally so. It referenced clarifying protections surrounding royal titles, preventing inadvertent commercial misinterpretation, preserving historical symbolism. But beneath the politeness was something sharp. A mechanism to strip Meghan of the ability to use the Duchess identity commercially. However, just as the alliance prepared to formalize the text, another twist emerged. A message arrived from abroad. Not from a politician. Not from a diplomat. From a Foreign Trade Compliance Bureau. It stated that Meghan's branding, if not regulated, could create international confusion regarding royal endorsement. And that was the moment the alliance became unstoppable. Because now, Parliament didn't just have legal grounds, economic justification, cultural protection, historic precedent. It had international reinforcement, which meant inaction would look negligent. And no MP survives negligence. So drafts were finalized. Procedures were scheduled. Supporters were counted. Timing was selected. But the alliance leader insisted on one final step. A step that demonstrates how strategic, calculated, and quietly brilliant they are. They ordered that the motion be introduced late in the evening. Why? Because nighttime creates uncertainty. Nighttime delays response. Nighttime prevents immediate media framing. Nighttime forces opponents to react tired, scattered, unprepared. And so, under chandeliers and shadows, the motion was submitted. No reporters waiting. No cameras rolling. No commentators speculating. Just signatures. And with those signatures, the first official step toward dismantling Meghan's commercial claim to Duchess identity became real. But here's where the chapter ends and suspense sharpens. The next morning, someone leaked the existence of the motion. Not the details. Not the language. Not the implications. Just enough to ignite speculation. And the person who leaked it? Not a politician. Not a journalist. Not a palace insider. Someone far more shocking. Someone whose identity sets the stage for the next chapter. Because Chapter 3 reveals the coalition behind the alliance, and the surprising forces outside Parliament who want Meghan's Duchess identity removed. For reasons far more personal than political, the leak didn't appear in a major newspaper. It didn't explode across television screens. It didn't trend instantly on social media. It surfaced somewhere far stranger. In a private online forum known for political gossip, institutional rumors, and insider speculation. A place where staffers lurk, journalists fish, and disgruntled aides vent under anonymous usernames. At first, no one took it seriously. The post was short, unadorned, almost casual. It read, "Motion submitted last night regarding restrictions on commercial use of Duchess title. More to come. No names, no context, no source attribution." But within minutes, something unexpected happened. Journalists began watching the thread. Within hours, political analysts bookmarked it. Within a day, whispers in Westminster shifted from, "Is it true?" to "Who leaked it?" Because the leak didn't just reveal the motion existed. It revealed that someone wanted it known. And that raised the most dangerous question of all. Who benefits from exposure? Because secrecy was strategic. Silence was intentional. Coordinated rollout was planned. A leak disrupted that. And disruption meant motive. So parliamentary aides began speculating. Was it an MP trying to build momentum? Was it a political strategist testing public reaction? Was it a palace official signaling royal distance? Or was it someone entirely outside the system? Someone whose interests were personal rather than political? That last possibility became harder to ignore when a second leak appeared, this time in a niche media newsletter known for receiving quiet tips from aristocratic social circles. The wording in this one was different, sharper, pointed, emotional. It read, "Parliament finally responding to misuse of royal associations. Long overdue. Long overdue." That phrase didn't come from a bureaucrat. It came from someone with history, someone who felt wronged, someone who held resentment, someone who believed accountability had been delayed. And as soon as that phrase appeared, attention shifted from Parliament to the people who had been most affected by Meghan's time as a duchess. Former palace staff, court insiders, royal relatives, aristocrats displaced socially, individuals who felt overshadowed, figures who believed tradition had been mocked. But here's where the twist thickens. It wasn't any of them. Because while speculation swirled around palace circles, a political blog published a third leak, this time claiming that the motion had support from external influencers concerned about cultural dilution. External influencers, not politicians, not royal commentators, not historians. Influencers. Who were they referring to? Business leaders? Cultural institutions? Commonwealth representatives? Wealthy donors with nostalgic loyalty? Advocacy groups invested in heritage preservation? The answer emerged quietly, and when it did, it reframed everything. The leak came not from a politician, not from a palace insider, but from someone connected to British branding and commercial identity standards. Someone who believed Meghan's business empire risked blurring the lines between national symbolism and personal profit. This group wasn't emotional. It wasn't vengeful. It wasn't ideological. It was protective of British branding integrity. And here's why that matters. If national identity becomes commercially exploitable, regulation collapses. If regulation collapses, markets distort. If markets distort, foreign competitors can weaponize cultural imagery. This wasn't about Meghan being American. It was about Meghan being global. Because global branding backed by symbolic authority becomes more powerful than domestic identity itself. And that scared people. Not loud people, but influential people. The kind who fund political campaigns, sit on advisory boards, shape cultural narratives, whisper in ministers' ears, write policy language without signatures. They didn't want chaos. They wanted containment. But containment needed a catalyst, someone willing to expose the motion before Parliament intended it to surface. Someone who understood that secrecy benefits Meghan because it gives her time to prepare messaging, mobilize supporters, and weaponize public sympathy. A leak removes preparation. A leak creates vulnerability. A leak forces reaction. And that's exactly what happened. Suddenly, Meghan's team scrambled. They reached out to media contacts. They searched for confirmation. They attempted to identify the scope of the motion. They monitored parliamentary schedules. They contacted legal advisors familiar with title restrictions. But here's what unsettled them most. They had no idea who was behind it. Was it the Crown? Was it Parliament? Was it political adversaries? Was it cultural institutions? Was it economic factions? Was it personal enemies? The uncertainty created panic. Not public-facing panic, but internal panic, the kind that derails strategy, fractures confidence, and forces defensive pivots. Meanwhile, the alliance inside Parliament remained calm. They expected the leak. They anticipated Meghan's confusion. They welcomed the destabilization. Because now, Meghan couldn't prepare a counter-narrative. Public opinion could not yet polarize. Media couldn't defend her without knowing what they were defending. Silence became Parliament's advantage. Speculation became Meghan's burden. But then something even more dramatic happened. The leak triggered interest from a sector that had remained silent until now. Commonwealth leaders. Not all of them. Not officially, but enough to matter. They wanted clarification. They wanted assurances. They wanted to know whether a duchess could operate commercially outside royal structure while still carrying symbolic weight in nations where royal identity still has cultural value. Their concern wasn't Meghan. It was precedent. Because if Meghan could build a duchess-branded empire in America, what would stop someone else from doing it in Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand, or the Caribbean nations where monarchy debates already simmer? This transformed the motion again. From regulatory to constitutional to global. Suddenly, it wasn't about a title. It was about sovereignty perception, and Parliament cannot ignore sovereignty. So the alliance expanded its scope, and with expansion came involvement from yet another unexpected player. A former diplomat. Someone with deep understanding of how monarchy symbolism affects trade agreements, tourism flows, and diplomatic tone. They argued that allowing a duchess to commercialize the title abroad could weaken Britain's negotiating posture by implying decentralized royal identity. Now the issue became geopolitical. But the most shocking development was still ahead, because the alliance was about to receive support from a figure no one expected. Someone whose entrance into the story reveals that Meghan's situation is not merely legal, cultural, economic, or symbolic, but personal, deeply personal. And when personal motives collide with political machinery, the outcome becomes inevitable. The growing coalition already had political muscle, legal grounding, economic rationale, cultural protection, and international concern. But when the former diplomat joined the conversations behind the scenes, something shifted again. The motion against Meghan's commercial use of the Duchess identity no longer looked like a niche regulatory clarification. It now resembled the early stages of a coordinated geopolitical safeguard. Yet, even that wasn't the true turning point. Because the most unexpected support came from a figure who had remained silent through every controversy, every headline, every interview, every feud. Someone who had never publicly criticized Meghan, never commented on her departure, never fueled the press narrative. Someone many assumed had no stake in the matter at all. A member of the extended royal family. Not a working royal. Not a high-profile figure. Not someone with an active public platform. But someone with lineage, and more importantly, someone whose own title had been overshadowed, diluted, and culturally erased by Meghan's global celebrity. To them, Meghan's commercial rise wasn't just inconvenient. It was humiliating. Because while Meghan transformed her Duchess identity into an international brand, this royal relative watched their own hereditary status become irrelevant, reduced to a footnote behind a woman who married into the institution and then walked away from it. This person quietly reached out to a political intermediary, expressing concern that Meghan's commercial empire made inherited titles appear meaningless, interchangeable, purchasable through marriage rather than earned through lineage. Their involvement wasn't loud, but it was strategic, because their private statement provided Parliament something priceless. Emotional legitimacy. Now the motion wasn't just protecting the monarchy from brand exploitation. It was protecting individuals born into titles from being eclipsed by individuals who monetized them. And that argument spread like wildfire among aristocratic circles. Not the royal family, but the families orbiting the crown for generations. The dukes, the earls, the viscounts, the barons, the families whose titles predate electricity, democracy, and newspapers. To them, Meghan's commercial duchess identity wasn't modern. It was sacrilegious. Suddenly, ancient lineage and modern politics aligned, not out of shared values, but shared fear. If Meghan could turn a royal title into a brand, then inherited titles lose mystique. And mystique is the only thing keeping aristocracy relevant. So now the coalition included politicians, economists, constitutional scholars, branding regulators, Commonwealth voices, diplomatic analysts, aristocratic traditionalists, each with different motives, each with different fears, each with different goals, but united against one outcome: a world where Meghan, not the monarchy, defines what a duchess is. That was the tipping point. Because when power structures feel threatened, they don't fight openly. They coordinate quietly. And that is exactly what began to unfold. Meetings, correspondence, advisory notes, private consultations. Not dramatic, not sensational, not public. Intentional, quiet, surgical. Meanwhile, Meghan's team was still scrambling in confusion, unable to trace the leak, unable to identify the threat, unable to determine whether this was rumor, regulation, political resentment, or cultural revenge. They searched for the source. They searched for the motive. They searched for the angle. But they looked in the wrong direction. Toward Parliament, toward media, toward the palace. They didn't look toward the aristocracy. They didn't consider that the greatest catalyst would be someone whose name rarely makes headlines, someone who observed quietly, someone who understood influence doesn't require fame. And while Meghan's strategists tried to assess messaging risk, the coalition expanded again, this time to a place no one anticipated. British cultural institutions, museums, heritage trusts, historical preservation councils. Why would they care? Because they rely on royal symbolism to attract funding, tourism, and educational relevance. If Duchess identity becomes commercial instead of ceremonial, they lose cultural leverage. And they expressed concern, quietly, formally, and in writing. Their statements didn't attack Meghan. They attacked ambiguity. Ambiguity is dangerous in governance. Ambiguity creates loopholes. Ambiguity becomes precedent. So now, the coalition's foundation was so broad, so layered, and so multidimensional that opposing it would make any politician appear reckless. But the most explosive layer was still to come, because while this coalition formed publicly invisible connections, another group took interest. British media owners. Not reporters, not editors. Owners. The individuals who don't write headlines, they shape them. And they had a different concern. If Meghan's Duchess identity remains commercially viable, she controls the narrative. If Meghan controls the narrative, they lose leverage. And media never surrenders leverage. So they began preparing coverage angles, editorial framing, guest panels, public sentiment shaping, not to attack Meghan, but to soften the public into acceptance if Parliament removed her commercial access to Duchess identity. This wasn't journalism. This was conditioning. And Meghan still didn't know. Still unaware of the scale. Still unaware of the coalition. Still unaware that the leak wasn't a mistake. It was a trigger. Because now, the coalition was ready for the next phase. Public pressure without fingerprints. But before that phase activates, something else happens. Something that raises the stakes beyond politics, culture, economics, branding, and aristocratic resentment. A figure enters the picture whose influence is not institutional, but emotional. Someone whose mere reaction has the power to sway millions. Someone connected to the monarchy. Someone connected to Meghan. And someone who has remained silent until now. The coalition was already wide, powerful, and coordinated. But what pushed the motion into its next phase wasn't pressure, politics, or parliamentary momentum. It was a document. A document no one expected to see again. A document believed to have been archived, sealed, and buried behind ceremonial protocol and digital obscurity. And yet, somehow, it resurfaced. The moment it appeared, the atmosphere in the private parliamentary briefing room changed. Conversations stopped. Papers froze mid-motion. Eyes lifted. Because this wasn't just any record. It was a communication originating from the time when Meghan and Harry first stepped back from royal duties. A document outlining terms, expectations, boundaries, and agreed-upon limitations regarding the use of titles after their departure. Most people assumed that the discussion around title usage had ended when the couple announced their transition. The public was told what it needed to hear. The media published simplified versions. Statements were crafted with ambiguity designed to soothe both sides. But behind the scenes, this document told a different story. A story that now had explosive relevance. It contained language indicating that Meghan and Harry were expected to avoid using their titles for commercial purposes. Not forbidden, but expected. Not mandated, but strongly discouraged. Not legally binding, but ethically framed. And Parliament realized something immediately. If Meghan's empire relied on Duchess-based association, then she had violated the spirit of the agreement. The room went cold. Because now, the story wasn't just regulatory, cultural, or symbolic. It was contractual, informal, unpublished, unenforced, but contractual. And that changed everything. One MP reportedly stared at the resurfaced document and said, "This means she knew the boundary, knew the expectation, knew the limitation, and crossed it anyway." Now the alliance had something far more powerful than legal justification. They had moral justification. And moral justification plays better with the public than any statute ever written. But here's where the emotional weight intensifies, because this document didn't resurface by accident. Someone retrieved it. Someone forwarded it. Someone wanted it back in circulation. Someone believed Parliament needed it at this exact moment. And that someone wasn't a politician. It wasn't a bureaucrat. It wasn't a royal secretary. It wasn't a palace archivist. It was someone closer to the situation. Someone who had lived through the transition. Someone who witnessed the negotiations. Someone who knew what was said privately versus publicly. A family member. Not Harry. Not Charles. Not William. Someone quieter. Someone often overlooked. Someone who rarely makes headlines. Someone whose silence now broke not through words, but through action. Their reason? According to sources, they believed Meghan's new empire crossed a line that could harm the monarchy's credibility and exacerbate internal fractures that had barely begun to heal. And Parliament understood the implication immediately. If a royal family member resurfaced the document, then the monarchy was not neutral. Even if there was no official endorsement, even if there was no statement, even if palace spokespeople said nothing, this act signaled alignment. Alignment means confidence. Confidence means escalation. Escalation means inevitability. Now MPs weren't worried about backlash. They weren't worried about press pushback. They weren't worried about appearing vindictive. They had cover, and cover is political armor. But the resurfaced document contained something even more explosive, a handwritten notation, a margin comment, a brief, easily overlooked line added during the original discussion. The title should not be leveraged commercially, as it may mislead the public regarding royal endorsement. That single sentence validated the entire parliamentary concern. It aligned perfectly with the motion's purpose. It justified every step taken so far. It proved foresight and disregard. Because if Meghan had seen that language, then her business empire was built knowingly in tension with it. Now the alliance had timeline alignment. They could demonstrate knowledge, intent, departure from agreement. That combination is devastating politically. But the most dramatic moment came when the alliance leader asked a question that silenced the room. Did Harry see this document too? No one answered. Because there are only two possibilities, and both are dramatic. Either Harry saw it and allowed Meghan to proceed, or Harry never saw it, and someone kept it from him. Both interpretations lead to crisis. Both interpretations deepen the story. Both interpretations fracture public perception differently. Both interpretations have consequences. But the resurfaced document did something else, something subtle but far more dangerous to Meghan's empire. It reframed the narrative. She was no longer a misunderstood entrepreneur. She was now someone who ignored expectations, blurred boundaries, profited from ambiguity. And that framing spreads fast. Meanwhile, Meghan's team still didn't know the document had resurfaced. They were responding to the leak, not the evidence. They were preparing messaging, not defense. They were searching for political angles, not contractual exposure. They were fighting the wrong battle. And while her advisors drafted responses, Parliament prepared the next step, a step fueled by the resurfaced document and empowered by growing coalition support. That step involved expanding the scope of investigation from branding language to financial benefit. Because if Meghan financially benefited from Duchess identity, then Parliament had grounds to intervene more aggressively. And according to parliamentary researchers, they had already begun examining licensing agreements, brand valuation reports, investor presentations, marketing language, consumer perception studies, endorsement positioning. And the early findings suggested something Parliament suspected but had not yet proven. Without the Duchess association, Meghan's empire would be worth significantly less. That finding was the match. But the explosion? That comes next. Because Chapter 4, Part 2 reveals the second set of documents Parliament discovered. Documents that don't just suggest commercial dependence. They suggest strategic exploitation. And once those documents surface, the motion accelerates into something far more severe. The resurfaced departure document was enough to justify scrutiny. But what came next didn't just justify escalation. It demanded it. Because parliamentary researchers, now empowered and instructed to widen their review, uncovered a second set of materials. These weren't archival. These weren't historical. These weren't negotiated during Meghan and Harry's exit. These were recent, current, active. A series of investor briefing decks tied to Meghan's newest commercial ventures. These documents didn't merely imply association with Duchess identity. They quantified it. They projected valuation, not based on product uniqueness, distribution strategy, or competitive differentiation, but on something far more volatile. Perceived royal prestige. One slide in particular froze the researchers in place. It read, brand leverage factor. Royal origin narrative increases market penetration and premium pricing. Royal origin narrative. Not celebrity. Not achievement. Not expertise. Narrative.